Welcome to The Classical Mind, a podcast about the great books in the Western canon. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
And I'm Dr. Junius Johnson. And we're joined today by a really good friend of mine, Dr. Jonathan Juilfs, who's an associate professor of English at Redeemer University in Canada, eh? And there he's a specialist in medieval literature, particularly English and French language vernacular literatures. And his work sits at the boundary between literary studies and theological studies, which is really what you have to do if you're going to do medieval literature, because that's how they thought about it. I got to know Dr. Jones back when we were both students at the Divinity School. He was my second friend at Divinity School, and our first year there, we actually took a Dante class together, which was my first time reading through the entire Commedia with Peter Hawkins, who is another dear friend and has been an excellent mentor in Dante studies and whatnot. So we spent a lot of time talking about Dante together, talking about all the medieval things together, talking about Tolkien and Lewis, and he's a musician, he's a singer as well. So Dr. Joseph and I go way back, and it's just really exciting to have him here. So thank you for joining us, Jonathan.
Junius, this is a real pleasure, and it's fun. It's fun not only to reconnect with you, but specifically to do so over Dante. Um, I, there's this strange thing. It may have been Peter, it may have been some of my other medieval professors who have given this to me, but there's a special kind of club that the study of Dante kind of promotes,
Hmm.
and some of it is about teachers and students, about Virgils and guides, and then
Hmm.
this wonderful place where you turn over from being the student to being the teacher and to being
Hmm.
the maestro for others. You and I every time I teach Dante, and I get to do it yearly as a part of the humanities core classes that we have at Redeemer, I think of you, and I think of how it is fun that I get to teach out of the things that we've had conversations about. So
Yeah.
this is pure joy for me.
That's exactly right. It's in the sense, in Inferno, so much of it is about the Virgil Dante relationship. And it's as if we've kind of made that shift to Purgatorio now, where so much of the relationships are horizontal, and your folks are calling out to one another and encouraging one another along the way, and the prayers of the living helping the dead and all of that. And then, so yeah, I feel like we're definitely on that journey, and I look forward to the time when we'll be able to reach that Paradiso stage when we'll have renewed in-person fellowship and can go over these things at our leisure. But we'll borrow a page from that book today and get a little foretaste of what that'll be like. Well, listen, Paradiso is crazy. We're gonna just dive right into this, and I think the first thing that is important to say, I'll take you all the way back to our first guest, Catherine Illingworth, who was mad at me for having her do the Inferno when it's her least favorite of all of the canticles. And you heard our last guest, Heidi, say that Purgatorio was her favorite of the canticle. For none of us is Inferno our favorite one. It's everyone's least favorite, not because it's not amazing, it's so very good, but just because they just keep getting better. And for me, my favorite is Paradiso. And I think that for me, that's almost a litmus test of a true Dantista is, do you like Paradiso more than the others? Because I think Dante would say that Paradiso was not only his favorite, but also the point of the thing. It's the reason for which the whole thing was written. But it's the least taught of the three today for a variety of reasons. The chief one, I think, is that most people would find it boring. There's just, what's going on. Nobody's suffering. There's no pain. There's no tension. There's just stuff. And then the second reason is it's the most studied. So it requires the most out of you in terms of your knowledge of what they're talking about. And you've really got to think theologically to track with it. And even among Christian readers of the poem today, a lot of times the level of theological reflection that Dante's assuming that you would bring to it is not there. So one of the things that I hope we'll be able to do in this episode today, so my big goal is to show you that Paradiso is not boring, but that it is the most interesting and exciting of them, and that it's well worth your time. And as Catherine said 2 episodes ago, if you have to leave one out, don't leave this one out. Right? Leave out Inferno before you leave out Paradiso, because that's at the heart of what this whole project is. So with that in mind, um, Jonathan, when we were doing this with Peter, he did this exercise. This has always stuck with me. He asked us all, he gave us this homework assignment to go home and think about an image of blessedness and bring it back. And then he started the class going around and asking people to share their images of blessedness. And that was a really, really cool thing. And it really, I had two. The first one was liquid light. And the second one was the moment of transition from the third movement to the fourth movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, when it just sort of is churning and churning, and then it just builds and it opens up effortlessly like sunlight breaking through. I don't know if you remember what your moment of blessedness was 30 some years ago.
That's a great question, and I don't remember offhand. I'll give two, partly because I can, and partly because in some senses your own book about beauty always inspires me to get thinking about what my notions of beauty really are, and that has mellowed, I think, with
Mm,
age and teaching and lots of experiences with my students. And I think the first one is a childhood one. Being a
mm,
child of the Pacific Northwest, my first serious image of God was the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. And
yeah.
there is still, I have told my family that if God takes me home at some point, you will find my spirit on the Central Oregon coast.
Mm,
It will be in a couple of places where God and His wondrous creativity has brought kind of stark cliffs right down on the ocean.
mm,
There's crazy waves that can happen in there. But my favorite kind of image is actually on a crystal clear day, and
mm,
that doesn't happen very often on the coast. Usually, it's wet and rainy. But when it's clear, the horizon blends with the skyline, and there's just something to me. Part of my, I think, even my childhood thinking about God was about limitlessness.
mm,
And there was something about the ocean that I couldn't find the end of it. I couldn't see beyond the horizon of my own
mm,
experience. And there is something absolutely stunning when you see the sunlight unhindered by cloud just kind of
mm,
create a line off into the horizon. Those who have read Lewis's Voyage of the Dawn Treader, there's
mm,
some images like that, I think, in the final chapters of that book. But that's one image that comes to mind of kind of the limitlessness, the infinite of the ocean.
yeah.
I also have a bargain with God. I know we're not supposed to make bargains with God, but one of my bargains with God is that in this life, I'm not going to have enough money to probably to own my own boat at any point,
Mm,
but I would sure like to learn how to sail from
mm,
Him in the world to come. And that's
mm,
long been a kind of animating image for me in the future. The other one, and I can't resist the music since you talked about Beethoven. My adult years, really since we were spending time together at the Divinity School, have fallen in love with the choral works of Morton Lauridsen. And if you know
mm,
that name at all, I would argue he's the greatest living composer. He's now 86 years old. Lauridsen's pieces they're contemporary compositions in terms of tonality and the like, but he has an incredible ability to set ancient words in really beautiful ways. And it's really through having sung a couple of his pieces that I first began to grapple with this idea of, as a singer, we rely on our voices, but in a really poignant or beautiful moment in a work of art that blends song and music in proper harmony, um, you can find yourself in tears.
mm.
And the crazy thing is, you can't sing when you're crying. So
Yep.
you listen, and there's something about that moment that for me this is ecstasy. And when
Mm,
we get to Paradise 33, I mean this for me is the kind of experience that Dante might be having. That
mm.
place where our own senses are failing. It's more than words. It's more than a particular feeling can actually articulate. And so something about a great piece of music, and I love the Beethoven one too. That's another favorite. You can pick it, but those are images of blessedness.
What about you, Wesley?
Gosh, the ocean one is great, and I was thinking about how humbling it is to be in the ocean, and how
Mm,
vast it is, and you get that moment at the beginning of Canto 2 where he says, "Oh, you who are within your little bark," and so it does make us feel that way. So that's a great one. I do love the one also in Canto 2, the force and motion of the holy spheres, which are so beautiful that they must be inspired by the blessed mover, just as a smith imparts the hammer's art. I think that's just beautiful imagery. We talked a lot about ordering in the Purgatorio episode, and so you finally see that ordering on display in this beautiful, ordered manner, and there's this art to it, an aesthetic to it that's just overwhelmingly beautiful. And so I think that was probably the one that stuck out to me this time around, anyways.
Yeah, good. One of the things that I thought that was so good about that question for Peter to start us with that is it gets us thinking about what associations do we already have with heaven, and what desires do we have for heaven, right? And this is, as a theologian, I often involved in this question of people are like, well, I don't, maybe I'm afraid to think about heaven too much because what if I'm wrong? And I'm going to say, well, what are you worried about? Are you afraid that you're going to be disappointed when you get there? Because that's the one thing I know for sure about heaven is that you won't be disappointed, right? And so if your heaven is full of you want to be able to fly. Let's take Jonathan's boat. Jonathan wants to be taught how to sail by the Lord of the ocean himself, right? And that's a very humble desire. Um, if that's not on the cards, we can confidently say that whatever that desire is that's at the root of that desire, the reason why he wants to do that, there is something that will satisfy that better than what he's thinking, and that's the reason why he's not being given what he wants, because he's not dreaming big enough yet, right? And so I love asking the ourselves as readers to think about what do I bring to Paradiso as hopes and expectations and things of that sort, and then to I think it's important also to recognize that um, everything that happens before we come to the celestial rose at the end of this canticle is a pageant. It's a show. Heaven isn't really like that. And those souls aren't really hanging out down there in those various spheres. They're coming down and putting on a little act for Dante. They're condescending to him so that they can be part of the divine works of teaching him about the divine grace. Um, and I think it's really important to keep in mind that that's not really where they belong, but also it helps to make sense of some really weird parts of the text. For example, the whole discourse about the moon spots, which just feels like it's self-indulgent. I've got this take on this scientific question that I'm going to just drop in there. It's not in any way self-indulgent. It's absolutely tied deeply into the point of the whole thing, and it sets the tone because what it's about mediation. It's about what does it look like for God's glory and grace to be transmitted to folks in an ordered way by means of the hierarchy that he has set up. And how do we become the type of vessels that can allow as much of that grace as possible to pass through to those who are ordained to receive it from us, right? And he's learned this from Thomas Aquinas, who argues that the reason bodies have to be someplace is so that they can have a specific place in the order and therefore receive grace from the things above them. So there's a lot going on right at the very beginning there is sort of he's giving us a grammar, if, as it were, for this text in the same way that love was the grammar of Purgatorio. This is still love, but now transfigured into a different vein and a mediatorial graced vein.
One of my favorite parts that illustrates this is the two cantos where you have Dominic tell the story of Francis and then Bonaventure tell the story of Dominic,
Mhm.
because those different orders in the Catholic Church, I get to hang out with them at Catholic University pretty often. I call it a Catholic University Grand Slam if I see Dominicans, Franciscans, Benedictines, and Augustinians in the same day.
Yeah, nice.
That's a Catholic University Grand Slam, but they do function in some ways, at least in an earthly sense, almost like denominations with their own rivalries.
Hmm.
And of course, throughout the history of the church, there have been power plays between the different orders, for supremacy, and so to have Dominic, the founder of the Dominicans, tell the story of Francis, and then Bonaventure, one of the greatest Franciscans, tell the story about Dominic, shows this great kind of mediation that's occurring, this great recognition of their parts in the larger scheme of the life of the church, and an acceptance and celebration of that. So it is a kind of harmony again that's playing out, and I just love that so much. That's one of my favorite two cantos, just for that reason. You see them setting aside the rivalry and realizing
Hmm.
they work together for a common end.
Hmm.
Junius, your comment earlier about the show, and I think part of the problem we have with Paradiso, we're not imaginative enough.
Yeah.
Dante's got lights and cameras and music. He's got music like that. This is a discotheque in Europe in the 70s, man. There's light all over the place. We got different colors. We got meteors. We got crosses showing up. We got all kinds of fun stuff. And I think part of the deal, I think of Lewis here. I just got done teaching a course on Lewis and Tolkien with my third and fourth years. I had them read the passage out of The Weight of Glory, where Lewis says, the problem here is not that we desire too much, it's that we've never desired anywhere near enough,
Hmm.
dared to imagine that the life of the world to come could be so much more extraordinary than what we already know. I mean, I've got as my backdrop here, this is a part of Eastern Oregon that my family and I went to visit. We call this the Alps of the Pacific Northwest. And
Mm.
it's stunningly beautiful. This is a shadow of what
Yeah.
is still to come. And so I think some of what the verbal play that actually excites me, and I can't remember, Julius, if we talked about this at any point, but I love in Paradiso 1, I love the neologism trasumanar. And this has
Mm.
been really, in some senses, the obsession of the last 30 years for me. What is Dante getting in? And I was reviewing one of the great writers about this, Stephen Botterill, 1994, wrote a book on Dante and the mystical tradition, and he
Mm.
closes with Bernard and what is the connection here between the idea of trasumanar, perhaps, and the idea of deificare, of
Mm.
being made a god.
Hmm.
Botterill is actually very reserved in his opinion and says, actually, I don't think the two are the same word at all. He says, I think the idea of trasumanar, which in Italian is literally to transhumanize,
Hmm.
is not the same thing as saying theosis or becoming a divinity.
Hmm.
What I think works in my own mind as I was reviewing that essay is that there is a stage in between divinity
Mm.
and humanity, something that Augustine calls a kind of souped up humanity, our prelapsarian selves, something
Mm.
of that sort, right? And so Dante comes into paradise needing a jazzed up system of response
Hmm.
so that he can even perceive and enjoy and listen to and see. I mean, these are things, not only is there a kind of I don't know if we want to call it a magic show, that might be a little bit dismissive, but there's a certain amount uh, of artifice behind
Mm.
that Dante is seeing, because the things he's looking at aren't material. They're
Yeah.
intelligible realities, right? They're even beyond what our senses can determine. So something about this, and Wesley, your comment about the lovely interplay of the different orders kind of speaking. No one is going to get this in full, but
Hmm.
even to catch a glimpse of it, a part of it,
Yeah.
is enough to propel you on the journey for the rest of your life.
Mm.
And there's something deeply, I've always felt this when Junius was talking about the reception of Paradiso. I think some of the reason the scholastic community struggles sometimes with it is that it's deeply evangelical.
Hmm.
He sees heaven as good news.
Hmm.
If you know what awaits us, then there is a whole bunch of stuff that we might be able to endure and undergo
Mm.
in the meantime in order to have that thing on the other side. And Dante himself knew all too well the pain and anxiety of exile. And
Yeah.
so I've been thinking a lot about kind of how these two things are related.
Mm.
One of them feels like a complete Debbie Downer, but
Hmm.
the other one is you might be willing to endure that if you knew the glory that awaited you on the other side.
Yeah.
And something tells me that Dante poet is someone who believes that this is real.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That question of Trasumanad is one that a friend of Father Wesley's and I, Hans Boersma, has taken up in his book. And um, before the book came out, he read that chapter at the Boston Colloquy on Historical Theology, and I was the assigned respondent to it.
Okay.
And
Nice.
so I sounded a note of caution about running with this notion of transhumanizing, because you don't want to get into the anthropological version of Docetism in the way that you interpret your soteriology, right? Which is so easy to do in a world where we think to err is human is a true statement that doesn't need qualification when it isn't, right? Because that belongs to fallen humanity, not to humanity as such. And so we've lost sight of what Lewis is always trying to remind us of is that humanity is something way bigger than we think it is. I love in Paralandra when Ransom sees Torah and Ten Israel unmasked for the first time and he falls at their feet and he says, "Forgive me, do not try to raise me. I've never seen a true human before." And I'm blown away, right? And I think I agree with you. I think that's what Dante's on about. It's not about becoming other than what we are. It's about breaking through the glass ceiling of what we always thought it could mean to be human, which is really less of a transhumanism than it is a true humanism, right?
Yeah.
But it requires a radical reorientation from the humanity that we've always known.
Whenever I've written I always use Musa's translation here. This is the
Mm,
Penguin edition, and the second Penguin edition, not the not the one that was done earlier by who's our Oxford. You know, oh, anyway, um, in Musa's translation, in his notes, he says, I'm really tempted here to use the word superhuman."
mm,
And part of what he was trying to get at was to keep it on the human side, but to say it was the humanity that we always should have had,
yes,
not something that we had to, it was something lost, not something that had to go above and beyond what it already was.
that's
And
right.
I liked that logic in part because it gives Dante's vision isn't going to end simply with Visio Dei, with the beatific vision of God, and then there's nothing else. Dante will
Mhm.
return. In fact, the whole premise of the fiction here is that he returns in order to write the great poem that this
That's right.
becomes,
That's
right?
right. Yeah, and there's Dante's biggest theological influences are Aquinas and Bonaventure. And both of them, when you look at their Christology, it's a very souped up humanity that Jesus has. Aquinas says that the human nature of Christ, his human mind and human soul, have the fullness of beatific vision from the moment of conception. And then it just gets even more souped up from there. And so he's got a lot of room with the to grow what it means to be human and what excellencies are possible for humans beyond what the modern conception generally allows for.
I have a question for you two, since you're both so well versed in all of this. Um, is what Dante's depicting here a return to prelapsarian humanity, or is it something beyond that?
Yeah, I would say that it's actually well, and this is a bit like what we talked about with Purgatorio, right? That it's the goal is to get to the glorified humanity that we had never seen,
Right.
except for the foretaste we got in the resurrected Christ. But we have to pass through the prelapsarian humanity to get there. And I think that's kind of what you'll see the pilgrim on as he's going through this journey. He's more like Adam, perhaps, in this first sphere of the moon, but he will have greatly exceeded Adam by the time he ascends to the prima mobile.
Yeah.
I agree. I agree completely. And some of this I was thinking about because I end the Lewis class with my students with Paralandra,
Mm,
and I get giddy when I teach that text anymore. There's just it's really such an extraordinary space.
yes.
And one of the elements that's there, I think, in the character of Ransom, one of the conversations that Ransom ends up having with the voice in my favorite chapter 11 of that text, I think, is just the most extraordinary thing maybe that I've ever read.
Mm,
He's wrestling with the question of what is the before and the after of the incarnation of Jesus.
hmm.
What powers did we not have before, and what powers do we have after? And in part, Ransom's looking for just simple validation about should I intervene in this
Yeah,
potential fall on a foreign world?
yeah.
And what he comes to the conclusion, and I love this, is that before the fall and before the incarnation, there was a simple problem. Humanity, Christ hadn't taken on a body, and
Mm,
so he hadn't glorified that end yet. And I stress yet, like everything in Lewis is about yet.
mm,
What is true now won't be true tomorrow or true in the future that awaits us. This sense then that each follower of Jesus following the incarnation is empowered as a member of the body of Christ to be his agent wherever in the cosmos it might be needed. Now, I always say to my students, I don't know if I'm a strict believer in alien forms of life, but I do believe that God could use every follower of his anywhere in the cosmos,
hmm.
whatever the situation might be. And with that then comes this sense that, and this is why I like Junius's answer. We're not going back to the garden.
Hmm.
there's a newer, even better destiny that was set up by nature of the events that took place in salvation history. And so, in some senses, I rely heavily on 1 Corinthians 15 here, which I think is, after the Gospels, the greatest book of the New Testament.
Mm.
When it talks about, Paul says it's a mystery. There's something going on here I can't explain, but he says the soma, the bodies, not sarx, not flesh, but that something is going to happen to us in a way that we have never known. Now, my cheesier friends might say, "Yes, I'll have a heavenly body. I'll be primed and pumped, and full of muscles and able to do anything that I want to." But I think Paul is imagining something even far greater than far
Mm.
greater powers. And so Dante gets a little taste as he enters into even the early orbits of Paradiso, of these new abilities that he has never had before, that no human presumably has ever had before.
Mhm.
And I think what that should do is actually help us to think and imaginatively about what heaven might look like.
Yeah, that's right. Well, one of the things that comes up a lot when I'm teaching this text, especially to Protestant students, is the question of hierarchy and the idea that some people deserve more glory than others. And that doesn't sit well with people. It ought to have come up in Inferno,
Egalitarians.
right? It ought to have come up in Inferno as well, but interestingly, it doesn't. They're totally okay with some sinners being punished worse than others, but when it comes to some people getting rewarded more than others, they're like, hold on, I thought God loved us all equally. Hold on, I thought. And I want to say, okay, fine. Okay, cool. Great. Think about your life. Think about how you've lived your life. And let's say you were to die tomorrow. Do you really think that you have merited the same level, that you should be placed on the same level as the martyrs? Do you really think you should be placed on the same level as the Apostle Paul? Right. And so, well, I don't think they'd mind. It's not about whether they would mind. It's about what have you done to yourself and what did they do to themselves? Because in Dante, it's all about, how you're fashioning yourself. If I were to allow this to be a Renaissance text, which I am not, I would say that it plays into that Renaissance fiction of self-making, but precisely because in Dante, self-making is overturned for God-making. It's what you allow God to make of the self, not what you can make of the self. That's one of the proofs that he's medieval and not Renaissance. But I digress. So I think we have to say something about this hierarchy of heaven. And for me, this I always go to Picarda for this because I think she's got one of those puddle glum moments, just one of the great mic drops of the whole Commedia when Dante asks her this question in Canto 3. He says, in your radiant faces there shines I know not what of divine that transmutes you from what we knew of you before. Therefore I was not quick to remember, but now what you say helps me so that making out your features comes more easily. But tell me, you souls who are happy here, do you desire a higher place so as to see more and to share more love? And this is a really urgent question because you might think, okay, I mean, you shouldn't be ungrateful. You're in heaven, right? We focus on what you have and not on what you don't have. But at the same time, how could it be wrong to long to see more of God, to long to love God more? And so I remember I read that and I thought, yeah, Dante, that's a good question, right? How's she going to handle this one? And she starts off, brother, our will is quieted by the power of charity, carita, which causes us to desire only what we have and does not make us thirst for anything else. If we desired to be higher up, our desires would be discordant with the will of him who assigns us here, which you will see is contradictory to these spheres. If to be in charity is here necesse, necessary, and if you consider well its nature. Indeed, it is constitutive of this blessed essay being to stay within God's will, and thus our very wills become one, so that how we are arranged from level to level through this kingdom delights the entire kingdom, as well as the king who enamors us of his will. And in his will is our peace.
Hmm.
He is that sea to which all moves that his will creates or nature makes. I think that's probably the greatest challenge that literature has ever set me in my life is to reach the point where I can say with Picarda, in his will is my peace.
Potent moment.
Yeah.
One of the images that comes to mind here, and I haven't had a chance to say this to Wesley, but I wrote my dissertation on two female contemplatives, on Julian of Norwich and Marguerite Porete. Marguerite Porete, who was actually burned at the stake in 1310 for a book called The Mirror of Simple Souls. And Marguerite's full historical context and even the textual context are complicated, and I won't go into those here. But one of the ideas that Marguerite kind of gives a visual to that I think is really helpful here. Mystics are always usually interested in kind of the coordination of the divine will and the human, right? And I always picture this as two concentric circles, kind of tubes that eventually kind of line up.
Mm.
And the point at which they do, then Marguerite's argument is that the spirit can move freely in and out of that vessel, whatever that vessel might be, whether it's the soul or the human heart, etc. And something about Picarda's formulation here feels it's not. I think Marguerite is derivative of other Orthodox theologians, so I don't think she's inventing this, but I think she's the place that I kind of encountered this, and I think Picarda is getting at. There's especially because Dante's asked a question about, again, about status, right? About hierarchy. And I think what Picarda says is that the goal of the blessed, whatever the case may be, whoever an individual is who hangs out among the blessed, is simply to have their will in alignment with the divine will.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing is, if your will is in alignment with the divine will, does it matter what place you have in the hierarchy?
Right.
Because presumably you're getting the fullness of blessedness through that channel.
That's right.
Junius, I'm going to ask you to help me here. I've always understood this to be Thomistic in its thinking, but you can fill it out for us. Something about the notion of each individual human soul has a different set of capacities. If we think even about like mugs or glasses, you could be a tall one, you could be a short one, you could be, a little Dixie cup, whatever. But that the notion of blessedness would be full, whatever your capacity.
That's right.
Does
That's
that
right.
line
That's
up?
right. You hear they're not egalitarians, and so the idea that even the notion that's a bit of a halfway house, if you will, for the modern mind of, well, we all started off at the same, but then as we went through making our choices in life, some of us shrunk our glass more than others. Even that they would not be okay with. Like, no, we did. Of course, we didn't start off all the same. There are some people who, I don't care how much schooling you gave them, they were never going to be a Thomas Aquinas, right? I mean, most of the people I know would never be Thomas Aquinas, no matter how much schooling you gave them. I'm not Thomas Aquinas, for God's sake, right? There are these differences in capacity, and it's not just about trivial things like how smart you are. Your different vessels are made for different uses. And so some vessels were made to be the fancy china that only comes out at certain meals, and some vessels were made to be the everyday stuff that's chipped and cracked, and that's okay because it's good for those type. You can give it to a kid and let the kid drink from it and whatnot. And only in that way can there be beauty in God's kingdom. I can get at it this way. There's one of the traditions about where fairies come from, is that when Adam and Eve had loads and loads of children, and then the Lord sent a message that said, "I'm going to come and visit you. I want to see your children." And so they line up all the children, and some of them they don't bring out. Eve hides them in the cellar because they're ugly, and so she doesn't want God to see them. And of course, that's foolish because it's God. And so God says, "Okay, I know about those kids," and they become the fairies. But among the kids that are lined up there, the Lord's going and he's reviewing them all, and he stops in front of one and says, "And you shall be a king, and from you shall come kings. And you shall be a prince, and from you shall come a prince. And you shall be a farmer, and from you shall come farmers. And you shall be a blacksmith." And he goes through it, and Eve is like, but Lord, I love all of my children. Why have you blessed some more than others?" And he says, "Well, if they're all kings, who's going to grow the food?" And this is a very medieval notion that, the beauty of the whole and the well working of the whole requires this sort of differentiation. And heaven isn't the undoing of that, it's the revelation of the true glory that underlies all that.
I think as Americans, we're very uncomfortable with this. This is why we have such a problem with this text. We're so tied up into what we do, and that really determines who we are. And sort of, we even attribute, I think, too much by way of judgment in terms of dignity, based on what we do. But someone like Therese of Lisieux, I think, is a good kind of maybe counter and articulates much of what we just said. It was her sister, I believe, who, when she asked this same question, gave her the analogy of the different size cups. The thimble
Mm,
can only hold so much water. It's not the difference isn't the variable isn't the amount of water that's poured. It's the capacity to receive. But also, you have this beautiful passage where she says, "Well, God even needs wildflowers for His garden, you know." And so,
mm.
whatever these wildflowers are, we may deem them insignificant, but they beautify the whole thing. They play an integral part in the larger whole, and so we need them.
Yeah. And so the experience of you as a vessel of grace, as a receptacle of grace, your experience in heaven is of being filled to overflowing. And grace is just pouring out of you, flowing out from every side. And so you are full, and that's your experience. Sure, I'm standing next to the Apostle Paul, and he is a big gallon jug compared to my thimble. But our experiences are both of being filled to beyond our satisfaction with the fullness of God's grace. And so, where's the complaint?
There's a lovely piece in there too, Junius, as you say, that you're probably aware of it in the Vulgate, in the Latin text. Paul talks about himself as a vas electione, so a
Mm,
vessel of election, right? And so that even that sense of the vessel, I think one of the elements that emerges from that too, and I know you're interested in Trinitarian theology, that when we make the claim that the Trinity is diverse, unity in diversity,
hmm.
then of course there will be differentiation in
Yeah,
the statuses of the blessed.
yeah,
And none of that should in fact matter in the end game. Like
yeah,
if my telos is as an 8 ounce glass to be full with 8 ounces, then I am full. It's 100%. And it
yeah,
doesn't matter, like Wesley was saying, it doesn't matter what the amount in the vessel is. I am full, or even filled to overflowing, as
right.
many of the images of scripture give us.
Yeah. You can see why it was so important that envy be purged in purgatory, because you can't have this perspective as long as there's a scrap of envy in you.
I might
Well,
also throw out as a little note too for readers if you're interested in medieval texts, the Middle English Pearl, which
mm,
addresses the divine economy and this beautiful dream vision. Another of my favorite poems, a poem that may have some Dantean influence. It's not easy to prove directly, but I think the Pearl poet may have known Dante's work. That this same idea comes up in there. That
mm,
grace is enough. Whatever you have is the best portion of what you have.
yeah, it's so good, and it's just it's you see this show up in pastoral manuals, medieval pastoral manuals, because they want to say if you can get people to really accept this, they can be happy, right? Because contentment comes from resting with what God has allotted to you, not from counterfactual imaginings of what God could have allotted to you, and not from comparison of what God allotted to brother so and so. Well, let's roll forward a bit. Jonathan, there's so many great passages, as with all of these texts, every encounter is gold and brings so much depth to it. But one that you and I spoke about briefly beforehand that we wanted to take people into is Dante's encounter with Cacciaguida, his ancestor. And this is an encounter that obviously is going to be very significant for Dante because he's meeting one of his blessed ancestors, and that's a big deal, both in the medieval Florence that he comes from, but also in the ancient Rome that he is further connected back to. But for those of us who are not related to Cacciaguida, it's one of the least interesting passages often. I know who Bonaventure is, and I've loved Bonaventure long before I came to Dante, and so it's exciting to me. It's like this great cameo when Bonaventure shows up. But all throughout the Commedia, there have been all these contemporary political figures that Dante puts in there that I couldn't care less about. And my eyes kind of glaze over sometimes when he talks about them. And I was especially unhappy to find one in Paradiso because here you've got the whole history of the faith and all these incredible saints, the whole golden chain to draw from, and instead you're going to talk about your great granddad. Like seriously, what's going on, right? Um, but I think that a lot's going on. I think it's very interesting. So take us into Cacciaguida a bit and why this is a piece that not only we shouldn't rush past, but should actually slow down and spend time on.
I was telling Junius earlier that this is a passage. So I taught Paradiso on a couple of occasions, and I'm actually slated to do so again this fall. And taking undergraduates through a text as dense and complicated as this, and without the reading of, they've read snippets of Inferno in one of their humanities classes, but they don't have purgatory or a lot of context
Mm,
to play with. There's always this question of, do I have them read the entirety of Paradiso? And I've had them do that twice. And it's always the middle section of Paradiso that I think loses them as readers. And
Mm.
so I share Junius's confounding. The question that emerged most recently to me, I have an outstanding former student of mine who's pursuing PhD work here soon. He texted me and he said, Jonathan, what is happening in the middle of Paradiso? Why is there so much bitterness out of
Mm.
a man who is ascending the heights of paradise? And I wrote him back and said, this is my classic answer these days, it's complicated. But also that I said to him, it's the right question to ask. What is going on here? And I'm gonna forward an argument to you. I'm certain it's not original to me. I haven't done enough kind of investigative study of this to know if anybody has really championed this. But at the heart of this, Junius was talking about the matters of kind of Italian politics, the tie that when we're talking about Italy, we're ultimately talking about its distant ancestor, Rome. We're talking about a poet who chose Virgil as his guide through the underworld. There is this interesting thing that the very beginning of Inferno showed us Virgil and said, called him Alta Poeta, the highest of poets, gave us this sense that Dante really saw Virgil as his guiding light, as an
Mhm.
intellect, and especially as a poet. And so, in some senses, when we think about what the trajectory of paradise is going to be, which is to the beatific vision, and we had to leave Virgil behind before we even got to the earthly garden. There's a question here that I think I've been wrestling with. I couldn't even put words to about. So how does Dante resolve the
Mm.
Roman question
Mm.
in his own world, in his own life? And I think Cacciaguida may be the key to maybe understanding a little bit of this. So let's set the scene. Junius has already talked about, why do you pick a great great grandfather and a great great grandfather who comes on the scene and says, "Well, in my day, Florence was great." And it really feels like that in a sense. I
Mhm.
don't know if Dante meant to be. The notes that Robert Durling gives on this, I think, are really interesting. We have in Cacciaguida's speech, which is one of the longest in the comedy, we have a mixture of Latin, Italian, Florentine dialect, and kind of low and high. There's like it's all over the place. And so, are we to take Cacciaguida as kind of a severe ancient ancestor, or someone who's like the grandfather maybe that you yucked it up with at Easter dinner or something like that? It's hard to tell. But what we do know is that Cacciaguida had been a crusader. He had fought in the Second Crusade and was a part, it sounds, like the emergence of the Florentine ruling families. Now, as far as I've understood from the biographies that I've read of Dante, he was not, he was from an important family, but not a wealthy family by the time he was writing and existing. And so something about this encounter, why do you bring an ancestor forward? And I think the text helps us here. So let's read a little bit of it just so that we have a sense of this. Um, let me pick this up actually in Canto 16. He shows up in 15, but let me pick it up in 16 because this is where, or sorry, no, I do want 15. That's the one that, yeah. Okay, so this is Canto 15, starting at lines 25 and following. And the picture here, Dante has seen a star in the constellation of Mars, which is a cross. And it's a fascinating, remember that Constantine kind of turns Christianity in or the Roman Empire into a Christian empire kind of through the sign of the cross. We've got that kind of intertext that's playing. And at the same time, this light falls out of that constellation that is the cross. And so Dante says to us, so did the shade of Anchises reach out devotedly. If our greatest muse deserves belief, when in Elysium he perceived his son. And just these three lines are loaded. I mean, this is Aeneid 6. This is the moment when Aeneas is in the underworld. He's been granted a special dispensation, just like Dante, even though Dante said in Inferno 2, I am not Aeneas and I'm not Paul. He actually is Paul and Aeneas. And we're seeing that here. He comes in and in this moment invokes the scene where Aeneas engages his father. And it's a very difficult scene in a lot of ways. I lost my father 3 years ago, and this plays very powerfully. Aeneas goes to hug him 3 times and gets air. and there's the sense of the separation between the living and the dead. This meeting is a little different, right? This is actually, again, a disembodied meeting of kind, and yet there's the implication that this is going to be real. This is going to be a real reunion at some point. And so at this moment, we get Latin, which is always a signal to us from Dante that something here is important and something usually Virgilian of origin. It says, "Oh, my blood, oh, poured out from above grace of God, to whom, as to you, has the gate of heaven ever been opened twice?" Cacciaguida looks at him and goes, "What are you doing here?" And I think the powerful thing that begins to happen here, Dante, in a very real way, is an outsider in heaven.
Yep.
And here for a moment, someone he recognizes comes in. And not just recognizes as like a famous person or somebody that he'd heard about in one of his texts, but actually a family. It's like, "Oh, dude, hi." And in the process of the reference there to blood, sanguis, we use blood in a couple of different domains when we're thinking about it. Blood is of course, what we need to live. It's life, right? It is also family, right? Descendants, it's ethnicity, what the Romans call gens, your people, your race, your ethnicity. But there's also, because we just had it fall out of the cross, there's the blood of the cross here too. And I think there's a competition of sorts that's happening. And the question is, which blood will Dante Pilgrim choose? Will he choose his birth family line, his Alighieri name, or will he choose the blood of the cross, the blood of Christ that gives you a new identity, that makes you a new creature? And so something here reads to me like Dante's real, there's several moments in Purgatorio and then again in the early parts of Paradiso where I think Dante is at a threshold, and literally a crucial moment, a crux, an intersection of pathways. And I think this is one of them. We know that all good Italians value their family line. They have inherited that from their Roman ancestors. We've got Virgil dealing with Aeneas, who is in the Aeneid being put forward as the father of none other than Augustus. We have Junius introduced to us the passage with Picarda, which ends with the idea of peace. Well, pax is another idea that the Romans are deeply interested in, pax Romana. But that peace was a false peace, right? That was a martial peace. And here we are in the circle of Mars. Like all of these things are kind of coalescing around one another. And Mars, of course, was the great patron of ancient Rome. What we get here is Dante wrestling with his own origins, with his own identity. And so this line about blood, and then a little bit later on, the image will shift. I'll pick it up around 46 and thereabouts. Dante Pilgrim briefly says, "Blessed be you," or sorry, this is start at 43. "When the arc of his burning affect had so spent itself that his speech descended toward the target of our intellect, the first thing understood by me was, blessed be you, trine and one, who are so courteous to my seed." And here we get another of the metaphors for family lines and genealogy, seed. The Italian over there is seme, right?
Same.
So, right? And the idea here that through our family lines, there is blessing, and we know this from the pages of Scripture, but we also know there's curse. And I hear the words of Joshua very famously, right? "Choose you this day whom you will serve," that everything is dependent upon where your allegiance lies. So, Cacciaguida goes about outlining in very long form kind of the early days of Florence, and eventually tells the story of when he was born and baptized and given the name of Cacciaguida. All of this, I think, sets in place then. Dante Dante poet is making us the claim that he comes from a distinguished line. They don't have to be wealthy today, but he comes from a distinguished line. That would be relevant to a crusader great-grandfather, kind of a great-great-grandfather, and it puts into kind of play this idea, I come of noble stock. But is that enough? Is that enough? And so what he ultimately comes to, and this is why Cacciaguida is still probably one of the most famous parts of Paradiso. Dante Pilgrim asks him, what is my destiny? Virgil has already given some hint that something really terrible is going to happen to me. What is that? And Cacciaguida lays it out in no uncertain terms. You'll find this in Canto 72. And you'll find this beginning at lines 46 and following. Mm-hmm. It says, as Hippolytus left Athens because of his pitiless, treacherous stepmother, so must you leave Florence. This is willed, this is already sought, and soon will be done by him who plans it where Christ is sold all day long. The cry of blame will follow the party harmed, as usual, but the vengeance will testify to the truth that will dispense it. And then this to me is one of the most powerful tercets in the whole of the comedy.
Yes.
He says, you will leave behind everything beloved most dearly. And this is the era that the bow of exile first lets fly. Mm-hmm. And there's this paradox. How are we getting this terrible news in the middle of heaven? There's a literary thing that's going on here, and I don't know that I can explain it, but I set this in front of us, thinking this is the thesis that I have in mind. That in order for Dante to truly enjoy the blessedness of the rose in the last third of the poem, that this is the moment when he must truly die to himself. He must lose his status as Florentine, as Roman, as Virgilian, if he is to become properly a Christian who is blessed.
Yeah.
I throw that out. What do we think?
Yeah, it's so good. That's pretty rich. That exile passage always strikes me so deeply. And the painters, this is the first arrow coming off of the bow. There's gonna be more. And the very next line, you're gonna learn how salty tastes the bread of another, which is a very specific reference to Italian culture. When they make their focaccia, different regions salt it different amounts. And so where he's going to be in Ravenna, it's going to be a lot saltier than he's used to back in Florence. And every bite reminds him that he's not at home and that he can't go home. Right. That's beautiful power. But that's right. I mean, this is painful. This is really, really bad news. There are times when some of the souls in Inferno seem like they wanted to kind of let this out. They're like, oh yeah, I've got a secret about you. Right. But yeah, it comes here because I think you're right about that. That he's still got something worth holding on to, something that matters to him that he hasn't yet let it go so that it can come back to him in the right way, so they can come back to him transformed. And just as throughout this poem, his eyes have to keep getting changed. They get overwhelmed by the light, and then they slowly grow accustomed to it, and that allows him to see more light. So he's also got to, it's interesting, this is not a purgation thing. This is not a sinful thing, because all this stuff was dealt with in purgatory. This is a non-sinful personal block still, a misorientation. Still, his loves are still slightly out of alignment, right? Yeah.
It kind of strikes. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Wesley.
I was just going to say, it strikes me as he's doing for Dante on the front end what Lady Philosophy is doing for Boethius on the back end. When she arrives, Boethius is in tears. He's despondent about his plight, none of which he can control, right? And so Lady Philosophy has to recenter everything on what matters isn't what can be taken away from you, because you really didn't acquire that on your own to begin with. What matters is that there are these virtues that have to remain kind of constant regardless of the fluctuations of life. And kind of a similar thing is going on here. You have to look to the ultimate end, to those things that can't be taken away from you in order to make it through these variables. Yeah.
Boethius is such a crucial intertext here. It permeates Paradiso. And if you get the Oxford Durling edition, Durling's notes he's even got the O qui perpetua, the Metron 3:9, translated in the back of the text. And it's so important because Boethius was the great tale of exile, right? His was the alienation. And I always laugh because I teach Boethius as well in the humanities course that we do. And I teach it with Dante in mind, a few weeks later kind of thing. And part of what I draw attention to, I always ask the students, how does Lady Philosophy look? Because Boethius gives us a pretty descriptive picture of what she's wearing. And she's wearing a dress. She's a queen. She's regal, but the dress is torn. And when Boethius comes to her and says, "Oh, woe is me. Oh, life is terrible. They threw me out. I've lost everything." And she looks at him and she says, "I told you it would be like all of my servants, all of the servants who love wisdom have been persecuted by human people as long as human people have been around.
Mhm.
If you thought being a philosopher and being a high-minded intellect would save you from this, no.
Yeah.
This is the brutal kind of truth. And I feel like that's why it's so stark to me, this moment in 17. I feel like this is Lady Philosophy now channeled through Cacciaguida saying, life is hard. And you quote the Princess Bride here. And anyone else who says differently is selling something.
Mhm.
This is the nature of our human experience. It's hard. It's grueling. Let me introduce another idea and I'll let you guys riff on it because I think you know where I want to go. But exile is the banishment from home.
Mhm.
But I think we have to read home here in a couple of different ways.
Yeah.
This is the difference between all of the great Christian writers who talk about patria, homeland, fatherland, the root of our word patriotism. Here he's saying our home isn't in this world.
Yeah. Yeah, there's that lovely image applied to the patriarchs in the Vulgate. It's that the word is peregrinatio, right? There were sojourners in the land. And I think it's this powerful choice that the Lord made to send Abraham to this foreign land, and then Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whom Israel will be understanding itself in terms of for the rest of its existence, were never possessors of the land that was promised to them. They lived in the land that was promised to them as those who did not have right of possession to it and who were just pilgrimaging through it, right? And then and the church picks that up in the Latin West. And yes, if heaven is our patria, then earth is in via. It's on the way, and we are viatores, people who walk a road or pilgrims, and then the Eucharist becomes our viaticum, the kind of food that can help pilgrims be strong enough to make it along the way, right? And I think all of that's here. He references bread, which takes us to the Eucharist. It takes us to that promise in Genesis, the first curse, when the Lord says, "You will eat your bread in pain." Right? All of that bound up into that because that's the only perspective that makes any sense from one up in heaven looking down on earth is it's tiny, it's small, and in its present form it is transient. And so yes, it's a valley of tears, but it's not so great a valley at the end of the day.
There's, even as you talk about bread there's also the reflexive piece of manna, right? Thinking about
Mm,
God's provision. It won't be what Dante wants,
mm,
and yet it will still be sign that God has not abandoned him, that God
mhm.
can go with him even in that in via status, that in transit status.
Mhm.
And I think there's something power to me. It's just extremely powerful. We at Redeemer built our core class around the idea of journey, of pilgrimage, and we start with the Odyssey and we work our way through these various texts, and we end with Dante in some senses because to me this is the great journey that is being implied. And part of the motivation for taking on the pathway is all about the goal, the
Mhm.
telos of that journey, right? And I think Dante may have imagined, and even at the beginning of Paradiso, back in Paradiso 1, he talks about when just before he gets to the Trasuminar moment, he talks about the fact that, I want to now make my ambition known. I want to wear the laurel crown as the
Mhm.
great poet. And he's got several references to the Apollo and Daphne story in there. And the thing about it is those are earthly crowns.
Mhm.
We are encouraged to cast our crown. right, upon the sea, and to allow the true king of the universe to take over. And so there's this sense, I think, that Dante, in this moment, I think what he wanted his ancestor to tell him was everything's going to be great, and you're going to be
Yeah,
restored, and you're going to be restored.
right.
And he tells him nothing of the kind. He says, no,
Yeah.
you're, and it probably doesn't know for certain that his life will end in exile, but certainly that he is in exile and is experiencing that as he's writing the text of the poem. There
Mhm.
is this reality that life doesn't go the way that we think it should. I always think here of the lyrics to the song I dreamed a dream in days gone by" from Les
Mhm.
Mis. And there's a line in there that has moved me deeply over the years as I've gotten older that says, "There are dreams that cannot be, and there are some storms we cannot weather."
Mhm.
Now, we don't say that hopelessly as Christians. We say that though recognizing that life is miserable. And I can say I am blessed beyond all measure. I have no right to say anything about what it means to suffer, but I have suffered.
Mhm.
I know what that means. And in suffering, I am sharing and partaking of my human brothers and sisters as I do that.
Yeah.
So something about this, Dante is very personal, is yet another one of these great moments when he becomes every man.
Yeah. That's really good. Well, friends, let's cast our eyes a little higher.
Let's go higher.
I think it's time to mount up to the Celestial Rose, or, as I like to think of it, that great football stadium in the sky. Because it's
It's
got
Notre
stadium seating. You know,
it's Notre
it's
Dame Stadium. It's
noted.
Notre
That's right.
Dame Stadium.
Touchdown, Jesus. It's got stadium seating. And so every soul is ranged in that rows. And they are sitting. They've got numbered seats, and so when you get there, you get your number, and you sit in your assigned seat, which is an rep shows your rank in the hierarchy. So you can see exactly where you fit in. Which again, that's a good thing. That's exciting. It allows you to rejoice in the particularities of where you are. So when Cato gets there, and by my supposition, takes the absolute last seat, the lowest place down seat, the guy who barely is got it in, right? He's going to sit there and see all of these innumerable souls ranged above him and recognize, oh man, how lucky I am just to be on the show, right? Just to have pulled that last ticket just in time at the last moment. And of course, at the top of this, you've got the Blessed Virgin Mary. You've got John the Baptist. The stadium is divided into two teams: Old Testament versus New Testament, right? Which again is to show the ordering of the works of God. And this is a beautiful image of how the work that God does in history continues into eternity in a transformed sense, that we can see that ordering and that division that's made there. And then something that I think people spend way too little time on, if the gathering is a rose, the angels are like bees buzzing around the rose, pollinating. Well, what does it mean to pollinate? It means you go to the flower and you take from what it's produced, and then you take that with you and you wind up spreading it to other flowers. And so the angels are facilitating the transfer of knowledge of God, if you will, that as this blessed person has this particular image, this way of understanding God that nobody else has, the angels become the means by which that gets spread around the rose to everyone else. It's really, really beautiful image. And when the resurrection of the body happens, this is where the bodies are going to be. The bodies are all going to come and they're going to find a place in that rose. So this, unlike what we've seen up to that point, this is not a pageant or a show. This is the thing. This is where heaven really happens.
Junius, let me chime in here because I first of all, I come from the city of roses. Portland, Oregon is called the city of roses. And so there's a fun picture that my mom has of me. I was about two, and they were living, dad and mom were living in a really simple apartment, two-bedroom apartment kind of thing.
Mm.
And mom had placed a rose in a vase on the table in the kitchen. And somehow I had gotten up on the table and I'm sitting there sniffing the rose. And I have always loved the rose as a kind of classic Western image of love, of desire,
Mm.
of beauty. There's literally hundreds of love poems and song lyrics and things that touch on this. And for we medievalists, It's a rich intertextual place with one of the great bestseller, the New York Times bestseller of the
Come
13th
on.
century, the Romance of the
Romance of the Rose,
Rose,
baby.
right? And
Yes.
part of the reason that I love teaching this text, I do a course specifically on medieval romance, is
Mm,
that we look at the secular romances, but I like to close with this because this to me is one of Dante's most genius moves, which is to
mm,
transform secular, strictly oriented human love
hmm.
by now seeing it in the relationship to the divine.
Yeah.
And I have to take a Lewisian kind of detail here because in the marvelous book The Four Loves, and I always have my students read the chapters on eros and charity. He defines eros there not as something to be ashamed of or something prurient, but he talks about it as the desire for something singular. And
Mm,
he genders it and says it's a man's desire for not for any woman, but for one woman.
mm,
And if we take that as an analogy for our spiritual lives, it's about our pursuit of
mm.
God, also about his pursuit of us, and
Yeah.
something about the way that that works. And so the rose to me is marvelous. It's living, it's alive. It's the inversion, it's the anti-image of what we saw in Cositas at the end of Inferno, and
Mm,
all of the static quality of the ice and souls that are cannibalizing one another.
hmm.
Here we have real community.
Mm.
It's vibrant. And like you talked about the angel, I love that image of the angels. I love bees. And so there's something about that that just feels elementally good.
Mm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the romance of the rose is it's an allegory, and the rose is an allegory for the beloved woman, but more specifically for physical union with the beloved woman. And the allegory, after thousands and thousands of lines, it breaks down and gets almost crass at the end, right?
Pornographic, it might be,
Yeah,
that
it
might be
kind
its
of
word.
is. Yeah, that's right. And then for Dante to be able to take that and effortlessly just flip it into this image of beatitude, it's an image of the way the divine works, right? Dante is you keep talking about Lewis and Tolkien, which I love. Dante is a sub-creator. He's doing what he sees his master doing, which is to take these things that are there and that are good and that have been abused in the Augustan sense and to bring them back to their proper uses. That's what redemption looks like. Redemption isn't just doing something good. Redemption isn't just doing something good that's better than something bad that happened. It's taking the bad thing itself and turning it into good, not such that you say that it was good that it came about because it was that this evil came about, but rather that this evil is undone by being made into what it wasn't before. And I think that's the kind of, if you're coming to this text as a 14th century literate Christian who's been keeping up with all the trends in literature and whatnot, and you see that at this moment, your head is just exploding because you're just like, this is crazy. I can't believe he did that.
Yeah.
He made the rose into the highest image of heaven. Who does that?
Dare we call it catastrophic in Tolkienian terms, right?
Nice.
It it's the unexpected, unlooked for, never to be looked for again, turn of
Yeah.
events for good.
Yeah.
And in a strange way, I might say that the romance of the rose is the deviation.
Mm.
It took the
Yes.
ideal and took it in a different place. But
Yep.
in that sense, Dante is recovery. So
That's right.
I like that too. That's another Tolkienian word that we could play with. And I think part of the beauty of this is getting. I love that the image is organic.
Mm.
The images of Revelation are of a city, right, that is
Mm.
built in the New Jerusalem, and it's magnificent. It's also, in some senses, for me, far more difficult to imagine than this rose is.
Mm.
The rose has a again a simplicity that I love. Anybody who gardens will know, hopefully, what a rose is, and there's something about its beauty, its simplicity, its life-givingness. It just is. It's the perfect image, I think, for the divine,
Yeah.
or what the community of the divine will look like.
Yeah. One thing that is worth pointing out, we haven't talked about this yet. Dante sent the Paradiso to his patron Congrande with a letter that we have. And in this letter, Dante explains fourfold exegesis. We did an episode on fourfold exegesis a few months ago, so if you did miss that, check it out. I think it's one of our best. The reason Dante writes a letter about this is because he wants to tell him, I want you to read this book that way. He means it over the entire Commedia, but he especially means it with Paradiso. When you get to Paradiso, there's always at least four things happening all the time. And so part of what you're watching us or listening to us do here in this episode is try to mine down into some of that and reveal some of those riches. But this is the argument about this not being boring. It's not boring, it's demanding. It requires you to look beyond the surface and to reach for other connections and to see yourself in it and all of these other sorts of things. I mean, it's way more personal than either of the other two were, because if there's something voyeuristic about hell, and then if there's something convicting about purgatory, here it Paradiso really asks you to find your perfect place in the hierarchy such that your piece is also in his will. And so that's what's great about teaching this text is there's so much underneath the surface to mine here, but it's also what it means to be a reader of the Commedia, a lifelong reader of the Commedia. It's in many ways you're gathering resources and skills from the first two canticles that you're going to need if you're going to correctly interpret what's happening here in this last one. And when you get to the end of Paradiso, you will know that you've missed a lot and that you're going to have to keep going through and it's going to keep revealing new depths as time goes on.
It's also a wonderful, as I've prepared for this podcast, thinking for several months about Paradiso, I see Paradiso. This is true of Inferno and Purgatory, but I think especially true of Paradiso. This is the best of Dante's library. We get a
Hmm.
sense of what he was reading and interacting with.
Hmm.
And it's one of the reasons why I always say to my first year humanities students, Dante is really the patron saint of the liberal arts
Mm.
because in order to read him, it requires the liberal arts. You must come at from several different disciplines and several different kind of conversations that thinking people have had over many centuries. And I think the beauty of that kind of encapsulated here at the end, not only but because he's chosen to remake a literary image that was well known in his day and age. I think he's setting up for his future reader. I think this is one of the interesting things about the letter to Can Grande, is that Dante was imagining the reception of his text. He cared
Hmm.
about what people did with it. And in a day and age, certainly in Dante's own time, because one of his later successors, Chaucer, in the English tradition, would actually
Mm.
talk about the problems of once you let a manuscript go, anything can happen to it, right?
Yeah,
Go,
that's right.
little book, right?
Yeah.
So there's this fear not only about how a text is transmitted, but also about the interpretive community that develops around a particular text. I think what it demonstrates is Dante's the singularity of his vision. He really did understand what he was trying to construct here. When we get to the beatific vision, we can talk about where it breaks down, because
Hmm.
ultimately those desires as an author, I think, break down, and they break down beautifully in the light of the true author, the author of all things, right? But there's this sense that as he's working here, showing us the picture of what the celestial community looks like, the celestial commonwealth, which is a different thing in Lewis's Paralandra, but it has a similar kind of ring to me, the sense that all of the cosmos is involved here.
Hmm.
There's a sense that this is what it means. I'm going to read a little passage from Lewis. Can't help it. Um, this is from The Weight of Glory, and if you haven't ever read The Weight of Glory, it is absolutely worth a half an hour or an hour to sit down and read the entirety of this thing. It's absolutely amazing. But he's talking about beauty and about desire and about how these two things are related. And he says, we as human beings want so much more, something the books on aesthetics take little notice of, but the poets and the mythologies know all about it.
Mm.
We do not merely want to see beauty, though God knows, even that is bounty enough. We want something else which can hardly be put into words, to be united with the beauty we
Mm.
see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, to become part of it, to have angelic honey dripped on us in the road. Like this is the heart and soul of what our faith is driving towards.
Mm.
the incorporation of ourselves with the things that are beautiful. Not yet, but still to come.
Mm. You know, I had wanted to talk about the Trinitarian and incarnational theology of Canto 33, but I kind of don't think I want to now because what Jonathan just said is such a good place to bring it to a close.
There's a power, I think. And one of the things about Canto 33 that I think is so moving, and I didn't pick these things up in my initial reads of it. There's several references in there to leaves, to
Mm,
folia. And, and for those of us who know the manuscript culture of the Middle Ages, leaves are a sign, if you will, of books and of learned writing. And he uses in that moment another Virgilian metaphor. I mean, it's so appropriate that he
mm,
ends in some senses with a Virgilian metaphor there as well about the leaves when the Sibyl gives her prophecies, and especially the one that she will give to Aeneas that about his future, we get this sense that the what Virgil talks about is how the musings of the Sibyl are like scattered pages.
mm.
And I think Dante's book gets scattered here at the very end because what he is seeing is so magnificent,
Yeah.
so beyond what a single pen could ever put down. And yet, I don't think he's disheartened by that.
Yeah.
I've encountered readers who've said to me, "Man, he promises all of this, and then he denies us the vision at the end." And I said, "Oh, but for the best of reasons.
Yeah.
We
That's
don't
right.
have a lexicon for this."
That's right. It's come and see. If you want to know what I saw, you have to take the journey. Get in your little bark and let's
Absolutely,
go. Right.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, gentlemen, it's time for some end notes. And it is our custom to allow our guests to go first with the end note, which makes them least likely to be preempted by someone else. So, Jonathan, what would you offer us as a follow-up, if you will, or a companion piece to Paradiso?
Oh, there's the opportunities are rich, and I certainly hope I won't step on any bounds with this. I mentioned earlier the Middle English Pearl, which was actually I read Dante as an undergraduate and then did a project on the Middle English Pearl. Um, I think Pearl is one of the most exquisitely beautiful poems I've ever
Mm,
encountered in any language, and it's not a rival to Dante. It's a different kind of take on Dante, but I think it was through Pearl that I got connected with Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy,
mm,
and with the Romance of the Rose. And so I see like there's a whole nexus of texts that are just kind of
yeah.
interacting with one another in that space. So I would highly recommend those. For interested readers, Jane Beale, who's one of the great Pearl poet scholars right
Mm,
now, has published an edition with translation and excellent notes
mm.
through Broadview Press, so you could look for that. I got my teeth cut on Marie Boroff's translation through Yale University Press, and Marie was a star,
Mhm.
and she signed my copy of Pearl. I had the good fortune to get to meet her at a lecture, and when I told her my name was Jonathan Juilfs, she said, "Oh, an alliterative name," and that's what she wrote in my text, and I love that. So I would recommend that. Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy is another literary kind of follow up.
Mhm.
I might also encourage, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, Junius. I remember Peter Hawkins talking in the years that we were doing that about the movie What Dreams May Come,
Yes.
kind of a riff. It's a secular riff. I
Hmm.
wouldn't argue it's a great movie, but there's some interesting kind of playoffs if you're interested in a kind of visual read of
Yeah.
some of the matters here. So that would be some of my suggestions.
Yeah. Well, we had that Borough lecture together. Was that when had her translation came out? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, when
yeah.
she was working on patience.
Yeah, yeah. And then so there was a big event at Yale and we went to that
Yeah,
together. Yeah, it was great.
yeah. That was when Catherine Kirby Fulton was with us, and
Oh,
and
that's
we
right.
all hiked down there for that event. So
Nice. Wesley, what about you?
Well, I think we have to keep the T.S. Eliot streak alive. In the first in Inferno, we did the Wasteland, and then in the Purgatorio, we did Ash Wednesday. And so I think I'll have to go with the Little Gidding, which is the
Mm,
last of the four quartets. But there is this kind of heavenly ascent in the poem as you go through its movements, beginning with the Eucharist. I think in the first movement, he says it doesn't really matter which route you take, but when you get here, you're not to do anything. You're not here to be curious or to instruct yourself, but you're here for prayer. And so
Mm,
he says here the intersection of the timeless moment is England and nowhere, never and always.
mm,
Um, Anticipating, I think, that kind of final end that we experience just a little piece of when we participate in the Eucharist. And of course, as the poem moves forward, he begins repeating that great Julian of Norwich prayer: all shall be well, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well," which is so beautiful. And that's really how it ends. Just that last little bar, he says, "Not known, because not looked for, but heard, half-hearted in the stillness between two waves of the sea. Quick now, here, now, always, a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flames are enfolded into the crown knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one."
mm,
Fabulous.
mm. So I have to say this because folks know that I'm not the biggest fan of modern stuff. There's a reason that Elliot keeps coming up here, and that is that he is so deeply influenced by Dante. That shows in the lines that Father Wesley read there, and it shows throughout the poetry. And so Elliot is a wonderful companion for Dante.
And we will do an episode about him eventually. I'll get Junius to do it, even though he'll be kicking and screaming the whole time. But it'll be
That's
good
right.
for you, Junius. You need it. You need a T.S. Eliot in your life.
I'll be the most reluctant convert in England. Um, and well, I would just recommend reading everything written in the Middle Ages. I think that's probably the most in.
Reasonable.
But no, to be more realistic, I'll mention a few things. C.S. Lewis is The Discarded Image, because more than anything, we did do a warm-up episode on Dante and cosmology, but I think at this point, going deeper into that is really helpful. Boccaccio, Giovanni Boccaccio, the great successor to Dante, wrote the first biography of Dante, and it's available. The Life of Dante. Vincenzo Zimbolettino did a translation in 1990, so you can look at that. And I think it's really fascinating to see what somebody who is the next generation after Dante, how he talks about this poet's life. And he's the one who first, of course, calls the Commedia divine for the first time, and that's why we call it the Divine Comedy. So I think that's a really interesting connection. And then I think I'd be remiss if I didn't add another Lewis here, and that is The Last Battle, the second half of The Last Battle, when they've gone through the barn door. Because one of the things that's fascinating about Paradiso, it raises questions about the afterlife. What are different ways we can imagine? No, let me say it this way. What are different ways to approach the blessedness of the next life through imagination? And so I think that comparing this to other images of that is only going to deepen our appreciation for what Dante's done here.
Might I add, Junius? I think Paralandra is worth putting in
Yeah,
this in vein as well,
yeah.
in part because it's a part of a cosmic trilogy,
Hmm.
and my students, we all of the students were required to give oral presentations, and the student who had the great dance in the last chapter had us do a class liturgical reading of the Blessed Be He's,
Nice.
and I was just moved to no end to do
Yeah,
that with my students as a kind of concluding act, not only for that text but for the semester. And I said, this is a foretaste
yeah,
of what heaven is all about,
yeah,
right? And so Lewis always ties the beginning to the end, as Dante does, and I think
yeah,
that's appropriate there. I
absolutely.
might also signal as well, because Junius and I were influenced so deeply by Peter Hawkins. Peter Hawkins's book, which is called Dante's Testaments: Essays in
Hmm.
Scriptural Imagination, is a fantastically brilliant read. I didn't bring up the chapter that he writes about Ovid and the Metamorphosis, but I think that single chapter is worth one of the greatest Dante prizes ever. And so if you're looking for a specifically Christian voice writing in response to some of the details, I think he's a great guide for that.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, this has certainly been a full 3 episodes on the comedy, and we're so thankful to have had so many great guests talk through this with us, and just rich conversations. And of course, we only scratch the surface because we're not a podcast like our friend Heidi White's Close Reads podcast, where they actually go through chapter by chapter a great work. We try to do more of a bird's eye view. So there's so much more. Maybe in future seasons of the podcast, Junius, we'll have to come back and circle through these all again, because I'm sure we'll be different people at that point. And so there'll certainly be much more in the text that will speak to us. But I feel like we could certainly do an infinite number of episodes on this and get something out of each one. So, but listeners, thank you for coming along this journey with us through the comedy. We're going to take next month, and we're going to do something a little bit lighter. We're going to be doing the importance of being earnest. And we also have a couple guests lined up for the next two episodes. We'll do that one, and then the June book is Midsummer's Night Dream, and we've got some great guests lined up for that as well. So we're going to continue the conversation, but in the meantime, keep reading.